Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be. Welcome to Virtual Chatham House and this particularly important and poignant Chatham House Roundtable on the Nemtsov murder and the rule of law in Russia. And it's poignant, I suppose, because many people joining today will have known Boris Nemtsov personally or professionally, and 5 years on, I think we could still be shocked and devastated by his violent death. And by the failure of the subsequent Russian investigation, although perhaps not shocked at the failure of that subsequent investigation, I suppose, knowing Russia as many of us do. But it's important as well, of course, because Russia's failure to observe the rule of law in so many areas is the root of the wider problem, both for the West's relationship with Russia and for Russia's own destiny and its own sense of itself. Therefore, I've asked Margareta Cederfelt if she could spend some time extrapolating what she has concluded in her report for the implications and prospects for a country and society which is more respectable, or which is more respectful, I should say, of a just rule of law, both in rhetoric and implementation. Now, to do the introductions properly, then Margareta Cederfelt is a Swedish MP, a member of a moderate party in Sweden. She's been elected Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE and was tasked by the President of that body, George Sadatelli, to oversee issues relevant to the Nemtsov case. And the product of that investigation is the report that we will put up on our screens in the chat function now or shortly. Perhaps you've already seen it in the invitation. Anyway, it's well worth reading as an important document, and this is the forms of basis for our discussion today. But Ms. Cederfelt is, if you like, the filling in the sandwich, and the other parts of which are not to be ignored. I've also asked my friend and colleague, Professor Bill Bowring, to comment on this report and on Ms. Cederfelt's presentation and offer a few thoughts of his own. Bill is a long-time friend of Chatham House. He's a hugely respected expert on the legal and human rights issues in the former Soviet Union. He teaches at Birkbeck College, University of London, and he is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and holds the prestigious Diploma of Honor from the Moscow-Helsinki group for his work on human rights. Now, first and not least, I'm delighted that Senator Roger Wicker of Missouri, who has taken not only a keen interest in Russia, he and I spoke about it in person earlier this year, but he has led bills which impose penalties on Russians accused of committing human rights abuses, and he is also a member of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Welcome, Senator. So I hope that makes sense. To recap, we'll have the Senator, followed by Ms. Cederfelt, followed by Professor Bowring. So that is as well-rounded and high-level Chatham House Roundtable if ever I saw one. We are, ladies and gentlemen, on the record today. We're not under the Chatham House rule because I felt that Ms. Cederfelt's report, Margareta's report, merits as much oxygen as possible. So that's over to you. So we'll go on for another 85 minutes or so, 90 minutes in total. So if I could respectfully ask our esteemed panelists to keep to time, as agreed, and we'll have plenty of space for questions and discussion to each of you, or possibly not to the Senator, who I know has to leave in 30 or 40 minutes' time. You can do the questions in the usual fashion, of course, by typing in your question to the chat function or by raising an electronic hand in the participants tab at the bottom of your screens. And then I will come to you, I promise. If my connection goes, my colleague Duncan Allen will take over, I believe. Thank you, Duncan. So with that, I will now hand over to Senator Wicker. So it's very good to see you again. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, James, and I'm so grateful to Chatham House for many, many things, including for putting this together today. One correction, I am a senator from Mississippi, just a few more miles down the Mississippi River.
I'm so sorry.
Missouri, but they're spelled somewhat the same. I want to harken back as I begin my remarks to the year 1997. I was in my second term in the House of Representatives then. I traveled to Moscow with a bipartisan group of House members to meet with Russian leaders. We discussed missile defense, private property rights, even mortgages for the Russian people. But one of the most encouraging meetings we had with our delegation was with First Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov. He was 37 years old. He was bright, articulate, charismatic. He spoke candidly on behalf of Russian interests, even against what he considered to be mistaken proposals from the United States and from the West. But he did so in a thoughtful and conciliatory manner. I left that meeting hopeful that this young Democrat might be the new face of Russian leadership, a leadership that would guide Russia to become a proud member of the community of nations and lead the way for a better, freer life for the Russian people. Unfortunately, this was not to be. As Vladimir Putin came to power and began to tighten his grip on the Russian people, Boris Nemtsov realized that his country was headed back in the direction of the dark past. And he spoke out consistently and forcefully and courageously. He confronted Putin and his cronies and demanded a better, more accountable government for the Russian people. Eventually, he was shot in the back, literally within the shadow of the Kremlin's walls. Boris Nemtsov's murder was the highest profile assassination of a Russian politician and public figure since the 1930s. It's now been over 5 years since he was killed in Moscow. Yet there's still so much we do not know about the circumstances surrounding his murder. What is clear, however, and what was clear from the very beginning, is that Russian authorities had no interest in conducting a full and impartial investigation to uncover who actually organized and carried out this assassination. On the contrary, they actively worked to obscure the facts by withholding crucial information. Russian officials have tried to obfuscate and wash their hands of wrongdoing by arresting a few people for a show trial and then closing the case as if justice had been done. By its inaction, the Kremlin is effectively telling other countries they should mind their own business, that the Nemtsov investigation is an internal matter that has already received due attention. But as a founding member and participating state in the OSCE, Russia is still bound by international obligations to defend the rule of law at home. All signatory OSCE parties have acknowledged that human rights abuses are legitimate concerns for all nations. When these responsibilities are shirked, the OSCE has an obligation to hold Russia or any other fellow member accountable. And that's where my colleague, Margareta Cederfelt, comes in. And she's talented, she's courageous, and she is acting responsibly as special rapporteur for this case. This unique position was called for at the 2018 OSCE Parliamentary Assembly annual session in Berlin, and was established with the support of the OSCE PA leadership, the United States, and many of our allies who are deeply concerned about injustice in Russia. Vice President Cederfelt capably took on this unprecedented role despite facing opposition from Russian authorities who have refused to cooperate and even barred her from entry into the country. This comprehensive investigation, which you'll speak to specifically, concluded that it is fundamentally a lack of political will among Russian authorities that is preventing the truth from coming to light in the Nemtsov case. We are left with the disturbing reality that Russian authorities are involved in a large-scale cover-up that may implicate even Kremlin leadership itself. Prospects appear dim that the perpetrators of this crime will be brought to justice by authorities within Russia. Consider the sham vote on constitutional amendments conducted in Russia a few weeks ago, which will enable Putin to remain in power for up to 2 more 6-year terms after his current term ends in 2024. Until there is a government in Moscow committed to the rule of law and human rights, we need to do what we can to draw attention to Russia's violations of its international obligations. In the meantime, there are important steps we can take. The United States has already sanctioned individuals implicated in the Nemtsov murder. Last year, the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on Ruslan Geremeyev of Russia's Interior Ministry under the Magnitsky Act for his alleged role. Geremeyev is a close associate of the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, whom the U.S. State Department further sanctioned just last week for his involvement in human rights abuses. Harassment and violation against opposition figures are nothing new in Putin's Russia. Boris Nemtsov was murdered for his ideals that he represented. In today's Russia, crimes against opposition figures, journalists, and anyone else who seriously questions the power of the state create a chilling effect and a climate of fear that discourages citizens from speaking out. Since the Nemtsov assassination, Russia's state apparatus has honed other techniques, such as fabricating cases, engaging in legal warfare, and using deliberately vague foreign agent and anti-extremism laws to punish dissidents. Russia has over 300 political prisoners today. The system that Putin has engineered over the past years is founded upon abuse and legal manipulation to secure power and wealth for the elite. But I can also report that the Soviet Union once boasted the world's second largest nominal GDP. Today, Putin's Russia is number 11 in international GDP. So the people have suffered. There are many Russians today, though, and this is a hopeful conclusion, who are risking their prosperity and security to engage in basic acts of citizenship, such as reporting crimes and speaking up about corruption. We need to cultivate relationships with these people for the future and stand firmly behind these committed citizens. But most importantly, free nations of the world need to continue leading by example. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of this important program.
Thank you very much indeed, Senator. That was both a stark and sophisticated introduction and context to the topic today. So I will move swiftly on, because if we do this on time, we may have enough time for a couple of questions to the Senator as well as to the other two panelists. Margareta, you have clearly done us a great service in this 43-page report, I think. It's very thorough. You're responsible for it. I would love to hear more about the genesis of it, the content of it, and the implications of it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And dear participants in this seminar, I would like to start with that I am very honored to have the privilege to be invited to participate in this roundtable discussion. And I must also say that this is my first roundtable discussion with Chatham House. I am familiar with the Chatham House rule of discussions and have heard it several times, so I'm very honored. I would also like to say that I'm very grateful for Senator Wicker joining us today and for Senator Wicker's contribution to the report. I have, during all the process with the report, felt a lot of support from Senator Wicker, and that have been crucial for me during the work. When I was appointed by the President, Mr. Tsereteli of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, a special rapporteur to pursue an investigation into the assassination of the Russian oppositional politician Boris Nemtsov. OSCE is the largest regional security organization in the world, founded on the Helsinki Final Act. The 57 member states hold weekly meetings on decisions regarding peaceful settlements of conflicts and cooperation. OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is the parliamentarian side of OSCE, and our perspective is security, but it's based on the pillars of political, economy, environment, and human rights. And this includes rule of law, democracy, and freedom of media. And I have handed over my report to the president of OSCE PA at the winter meeting February this year. During the presentation, I will present some of my findings. While doing this, I will focus on what I suggest in terms of corruption, political repression, and rule of law in Russia. And for those of you who would like to know more in detail about my report, I recommend you to read the report. It was linked here on internet, but you can as well find it on the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's homepage. And attacks are carried out on Russian citizens, not only in Russia, but in the European cities like Salisbury, Berlin, and Lille. As of today, the Russian citizens are detained in my country, Sweden, as well, for attacking dissidents. The attack on the opposition, journalists, and civil society are unacceptable and must come to an end where every day are performed. Unfortunately, the democratic spaces is shrinking in Russia and have been so for a long time. When Boris Nemtsov was killed on February the 27th, 2015, he was a leading politician with opposition and former deputy prime minister of Russia. At the time of his death, he was a member of the Yaroslav Regional Duma. Despite this, the possibility that Mr. Namsan was killed for his oppositional activities was ruled out by the head prosecutor. The investigation into the murder is filled with irregularities, inconsistent statements, and of unclear circumstances. The same goes for the trial and for the conviction of the 5 Chechen men for killing Mr. Nemtsov. Possible motives and the answer to who organized the murder were not investigated by the authorities and remain a mystery. As rapporteur of the OSCE-PA, I have not pursued a criminal investigation. The mandate granted is to bring attention to the existing information and to build the political will necessary for a new investigation. As I am not a legal specialist, nor a judge, I'm not able to determine the guilt of the defendants. Anyway, it should be done by a judge and not by a single person. Writing the report, however, it has become clear that the evidence upon which the 5 men were prosecuted and convicted is utterly weak and that there is no transparency in the legal process. Mr. Nemtsov was gunned down in central Moscow. The killing took place at the Bolshoi-Moskvoritsky Bridge, a heavily survived bridge in sight of the Kremlin walls. The ensuing criminal investigation did not present video evidence from nearby surveillance cameras, nor from any person. The scenario provided by prosecutor in court has also been found inconsistent with physical evidence and the confession. Available evidence and witness statements were not collected, and thus not part of the investigation. In no state where there is an independent judiciary would a similar case proceed to trial and result in conviction. Anna Drevitskaya, Mr. Nemtsov's girlfriend, who was with him when he was killed, was initially not allowed a lawyer when given her statement, and the statement from the court was incomplete, and she refused to sign it. During the trial, the judge did not allow for the defense to speak at the same length as the prosecution, and the defense was repeatedly times interrupted. I say this because it shows a bit of the procedure during at the court. It is possible to assassinate a well-known politician outside of Kremlin with no witness, no proof? This question have I found in all materials and I have taken part of. And I raised this question as well for myself during all the time when I have worked with the issue. I have sought contact with the Russian authorities to access material related to the criminal investigation. My request was denied with reference to law on state secrets. Recently, I received information that an oppositional lawmaker has sent a request to the investigative committee of the Russian Federation asking to clarify the reasons for the denial. In the answer, it was simply denied that I have made the request to access the material. The report, however, is based on information from open sources and is available, as I said, on the OSCE website. And I have used public information that I have been able to find, articles, documents from international organizations, and also contact with different persons and organizations who have read more about the assassination. And all the sources are documented in the report, and you can find them there. The implications of the Namsan murder must be understood in relation to the abuse of political power, the absence of rule of law, and the corruption. From that perspective, it is obvious that the murder of Mr. Nemtsov is representative for the repressive tactics which is pursued in President Putin's Russia. The Russian constitution clearly states that all people stand equal to the law and enjoy fundamental freedoms and rights. It is inspired by the French constitution and prescribes the independence of the legislative, executive, and judicial bodies of government. If the constitution was complied with, there would be well-functioning rules of law in today's Russia. Unfortunately, the reality is different. Since the early 2000s, Russia has experienced a decline in political competition, democracy, and respect of human rights. Gradually, Putin and his party, United Russia, has become the political dominator. Since the mass protests in Russia between 2011 and 2012, the regime has increased its way to constrain the opposition. The political repression have taken the form of murders, imprisonments, and harassments directed against oppositional figures, human rights activists, and journalists. During the period, the judiciary has been corrupted. It has experienced an increasing level of political interference and practically lost its independence. The legal presumption of innocence until proven guilty is not respected in the Russian legal system. Not least does this apply to the criminal investigation and the trial in the Boris Nemtsov case. Only a fraction of the people who oppose the Kremlin face the same fate as Boris Nemtsov. However, it must be understood that the same mechanism apply to the killing of politicians like Boris Nemtsov as the harassment of activists and journalists. These mechanisms are driven by the Kremlin, who exercise control over all branches of government, the law enforcement, and the security service, through the cobweb of corruption and connections. Influence on the judiciary is carried out by the Kremlin. Judges are vulnerable to corruption and pressure due to their low wages and fear for represalias. The political intervention turns the judiciary into an instrument by which the Kremlin repress journalists, democracy activists, oppositional politicians, and human rights officials. In other cases, it is used to conceal the wrongdoings and harassment which the law enforcement and security service conduct against the opposition and journalists. Our assumptions on rule of law are inverted in the case of the Russian Federation, even though the Constitution provides for fundamental rights and freedoms. The rule of law is constantly undermined by unlawful practice. The judiciary is dependent on the exercise of political power. The end result is that the administration of justice is unpredictable and inconsistent. Since the mass protest in 2012, there has been a continuous modification to the country's criminal code, allowing for the authorities to arrest and prosecute individuals on various criminal offenses. Among these are the infamous legislation on undesirable organizations, and foreign agents. Last year, new legislation was introduced on spreading fake news, insulting the states, and on internet control. Human rights organizations fear that these will be used by the Kremlin to restrict one-line speech and other fundamental freedoms. The power exercised by the Kremlin, law enforcement, and the security forces led to a climate of impunity. There is a clear pattern in which the authorities are unwilling to investigate crimes against the opposition. If investigations are pursued, they are mishandled. The rule of law is tragically undermined by this process. The ultimate consequence is that people who believe in a democratic and free Russia are put behind bars while criminals make careers and remain unchecked. A new, transparent, thorough investigation into the assassination of Boris Nemtsov is the first step to address the climate of impunity. A prerequisite for improvements towards less corruption and less abuse of power is compliance with the Russian constitution. There need to be independence of the judiciary and separation of powers. Fundamental for the future of the Russian Federation is also the protection of journalists and free media. Constant harassment and imprisonment of journalists prevents and undermines every step towards democratic progress. In pro-Kremlin media, the referendum of constitutional amendments, which was held earlier this year, were reported on as an improvement of separation of powers, giving the parliament broader mandate. However, amendments allowed for President Putin to run for 2 additional presidential terms. It is a cause for concern regarding the future of rule of law in Russia. The fear is that the corruption and abuse of power of the Kremlin will increase with extended rule. While the prospect of improvements regarding the rule of law may look poor, it is important not to forget about the Russian people who are living with the direct consequence of Kremlin's abuse. Earlier this year, amid the coronavirus crisis, Putin's approval ratings hit a historic low. The people's disapproval is also demonstrated in mass protest. A few days ago, up to 50,000 persons gathered in a region in eastern Russia to protest against the arbitrary arrest of their governor, who won against the Kremlin-backed rival in local elections 2018. I mention this because it gives a picture of how the political system and the power is used by the Kremlin. The protests are a reminder to us. We, as representatives of the democratic and free political systems, must not forget that the people of Russia deserve a better society, while the future of rule of law in Russia does not look bright. It is our responsibility to continue the efforts to hold Russia leadership accountable for the repression of journalists, the opposition, and the civil society. The assassination of Boris Nemtsov didn't end his work. He remained a unifying figure for dissidents after the murder. Every year is a march held in his memory, gathering between 6,000 and 10,000 participants. And this year, 5 years after his assassination, it was even a higher number who took part in the memory, in the march. There is also every day at the spot where Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, fresh flower every day in his memory. This shows that people are not forgetting Boris Nemtsov. He is still alive in the Russian people's mind. The Russian Federation is a member of several international organizations. Their membership to the UN, OSCE, the Council of Europe, is a commitment to democratic values. Russia's participation gives a valuable opportunity to to discuss these matters, as well as to put pressure on their representatives. As a member of the OSCE, I struggle to hold Russia accountable for their actions. I believe EU and its member countries should be more active in putting forward a question of responsibility towards Russia. Common efforts are required to put an end on the Kremlin's repression of journalists, oppositional and human rights activists. It is in the interest of Russia to cooperate on the international level, and as Senator Wicker said, also for not at least for the financial situation, is the Russian people who suffer from the situation that's today. I would also like to mention that the UK have made a significant contribution. A statement asking to review the efforts into an investigation was delivered to the OSCE Parliamentary Council by, not parliamentary, but to the OSCE Permanent Council by Ambassador Niall Bush earlier this year, and a Magnitsky-style sanctions regime targeting several Russian nationals has been announced. Imposing sanctions is instrumental in demonstrating the significance of democratic values. The names of those who failed to investigate the assassination of Mr. Nemtsov, as well as other oppositional figures, should be added to the list, and the Magnitsky Act of the European Union should also be adopted. And I could speak much more, but I will try to conclude now. And it's that the achievement by our American counterparts may be further emphasized. In particular, Resolution 156, passed by the Congress, and Resolution 81 by the Senate. They are calling for accountability and justice for the assassination. And I think this is one important step, and also an important step that the rest of the world could look at. And by this, I will finalize, because I know that I have been spoken for very long, and thank you so much.
No, thank you very much indeed, Margareta. As I said earlier, you have done us a great service, and there were many things you said which struck me. One is that you said that a fraction of the people who protest and object to Putin's rule and way of governance in Russia suffer the same fate as Boris Nemtsov, but I think we all know people, brave people out there in Russia who we've worked with and are friends of ours who we worry about for the same, exactly the same reasons. But I also want to thank you, as I say, and the OSCE, and I see that Mr. Cederfelt has joined us as well. Hello, sir. For commissioning this report. I mean, I would say, if you don't mind a slightly controversial statement, the OSCE has not always been the organization we might have wished it to be because of its inclusivity. I hope that's not offensive. It's not meant to be, but I do appreciate what it's done here, and it's really a very brave and bold move, and I do appreciate that, and I do look forward to seeing how you will continue, how you will follow on from this report, Mr. Cederfelt and Margareta. And then finally, to say, just building on your words, you mentioned the fresh flowers on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge every day. I know, I've seen them as well. The occasional times I visit Moscow myself. Only to say that there are also fresh flowers which are put on Stalin's grave next to the Lenin mausoleum every day as well. So it just sort of shows the sort of the counterbalancing in some ways. Right, over to Professor Bill Bowring. But before I do reintroduce him, Senator Wicker, I think you're still with us, but just to say, I know you have to go to a committee meeting. So if you have to go during Bill Bowring's presentation, we fully understand it, and we'll be back in touch. Thank you very much if you have to go in the meantime. Bill, Margareta was saying something about the Russian constitution being actually pretty good based on the French constitution. And I remember when I first met you 20 years ago, you said something to me like that it's not the constitution, it's the implementation of it. And that does strike me as still being true 20 years later. Anyway, over to you for your remarks and your own thoughts, sir.
Thank you, James. And first of all, it's a great honor to be invited to speak on this splendid panel at Chatham House. Thanks to James in particular. Not the first time, but this is a really great occasion. Also a particular honor to be speaking with Senator Wicker and with Margareta Cederfelt. And first thing I really want to say is that Russia is still a member of the OSCE. 57 members, as we were reminded. And even more astonishing, it is still a member of the Council of Europe, which it joined back in 1996, so quite a few years have gone by. A year or so ago, it was very much a moot question whether Russia would still be a member of the Council of Europe now. And in fact, Russia was not paying its subscription for a couple of years as a result of the sanctions imposed on it for the illegal annexation of Crimea and what it's been doing in Donbass. But here it is, it's back again. And Russian is the Deputy President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and is still subject to the European Court of Human Rights. And we're going to see what some of Putin's constitutional amendments to do with the relationship with international law in Russia actually play out in practice. I think it's really significant that Russia is still in these organizations. And we've already heard from Margareta that it's not as if Russia is a fully totalitarian state in which no one can express an opinion. James has reminded us about Nemtsov Most and the flowers, and every year the demonstrations remembering Boris Nemtsov. And I'll say slightly more about that in a moment. But I think the first thing we have to remember is that the murder of Boris Nemtsov in 2015 was, as Margareta reminds us in her splendid report. I really congratulate the OSCE for commissioning the report and for commissioning Margareta in particular. And that is that this murder was the latest in a series with the murder of Anna Politkovskaya outside her Moscow apartment in 2006, with the murder of Natasha Estemirova, my colleague with Memorial in Chechnya, who was abducted and her body was found in a field. And my colleague Orlov was prosecuted by Kadyrov unsuccessfully for criminal libel, for suggesting that the situation created in Chechnya by Kadyrov was a very important factor in her murder. And in the same year, 2009, and this is also in Margareta's report, the murder of my close colleague, the lawyer Stanislav Markelov, in cold blood, using a police-issued pistol in the center of Moscow after holding a press conference with a journalist, Baburova. They were both murdered to protest against the early release of Colonel Budanov, the only Russian officer to be prosecuted and convicted arising out of the Chechen War for the rape and murder of a Chechen girl. He was first acquitted on the grounds of momentary insanity, and I was very proud to be able to help Stanislav Markelov in getting that acquittal overturned. Anyway, he was murdered. And so we have not one, but a whole series of murders of this kind. With Boris Nemtsov, I think it's highly significant, as has already been said, that he was by far the most credible and appealing and generally very talented candidate for leadership of the opposition. And the great achievement of Mr. Surkov in the Kremlin has been getting the political opposition in Russia to self-destruct in many ways. It is not to say that there aren't very large numbers of opposition people around in Russia today, but Nemtsov had to be eliminated, and he was. And of course, as Margareta points out in her report, we have never found out for sure who ordered it, though we have very, very strong suspicions as to where the order came from and the execution of the murder. Just a couple of points. Margareta refers quite a lot in her report to the excellent report produced by the Parliamentary Assembly of the other international organization, the Council of Europe. This was a report in June 2019 by the Council of Europe's rapporteur, Emanuelis Zingeris from Lithuania. It's entitled Shedding Light on the Murder of Boris Nemtsov. And it goes into a huge amount of detail as to why nothing in official accounts fits together at all. What we do know is that 4 Chechens were arrested and put on trial. And just one example of how complex the situation in Russia is. This is also in Margareta's report, that the day after Tsar Dadayev was arrested, charged with this murder, Andrei Babushkin, who has been around for a long time as a leading prison reformer, founder of the ONK, of the Independent Prison Monitors, he used his status in order to get into the remand prison where Dadayev was being held with a journalist from the Moskovsky Komsomolets, which is not a bad newspaper. And they interviewed Dadayev, and there were clear signs of torture. And the following day, the interview with what Babushkin and the reporter had seen was in Moskovsky Komsomolets. And they were duly called in by the FSB, but nothing happened to them. And Babushkin is still fighting the good fight, along with a lot of other people in Russia. So all the way along to where we are today with the regular demonstrations and Nemtsov Most, Margareta has mentioned the astonishing demonstrations in Khabarovsk, which are demonstrations of dignity. What they're complaining about is that they elected someone and that choice was taken away from them. But there are these kind of feelings all over Russia. I just want to mention one more very recent development and quote the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, who's Dunya Mijatovic, and she issued a statement a couple of days ago, and this was to do with the indictment against a human rights defender in Sochi, Semyon Simonov. And this is to do with the Foreign Agents Law, which means that practically all human rights and civil society organizations, environmental organizations, are on this register of foreign agents, have to have on all of their published materials the fact that they are foreign agents. And Semyon Simonov has now been indicted for not complying with this legislation. What the Council of Europe Commissioner says is this is not only alarming, it will have a massive chilling effect on the entire human rights community in Russia. There is a human rights community in Russia. They are the people who are keeping the memory of Boris Nemtsov alive. And we can be sure that the present situation will not go on forever. James mentioned the Constitution, which came into being in slightly unfortunate circumstances, but in particular, the human rights section of the Constitution, which has lasted up until now remarkably well, does indeed seek to implement the standards, international standards of the United Nations and of the Council of Europe. And in fact, the criminal legislation, which was introduced after 1991 from 2000 onwards, again, was seriously seeking to implement Council of Europe standards. We know from research which is done that even the judiciary in Russia is not monolithic. And there's no time today to talk about that. So there are all kinds of stresses and strains within Russian society. But I just want to end by saying, repeating my congratulations of Margareta and of the OSC for this splendid report, which will make us read Mr. Zingeris's report again. And I think the situation in Russia needs following very closely because the slogans in Khabarovsk went very quickly from release our governor whom we elected, and they very quickly moved to down with Putin and the change which is needed in Russia today. So thank you very much again. I think I kept to my 10 minutes more or less. Over to you, James.
You did indeed, Bill, and thank you very much for your customary professionalism and your mixture of anecdote and analysis, which we know of you so well. Let me see. ladies and gentlemen. Senator Wicker, are you still with us? I can see your name up there, but I do have a question for you, or there is a question for you, if you're still there and with us. It doesn't mean to say you are there. Maybe I'll give you 3 seconds, Senator. If not, I shall simply move on to open the floor out. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the senator, as I said, did have to go to a committee meeting, and although his name is with us, and I think he is not in person. Thanks again to all 3 panelists, of whom 2 survive, and I will sort of open the floor out, and perhaps I could, I suppose, Margareta, if I may start with you, whilst everybody else continues to think up questions. I see some coming through on the chat now, but I didn't fully understand, and as I say, I can see Mr. Saratelli is with us, and I hope he didn't take offense at my comments about the OSCE, but I would be intrigued to know precisely why the OSCE decided to commission this report. And I think I've asked this question already, but what are the next steps for the OSCE as well? If you like, I suppose, what do you think the operational conclusions from it should be, Margareta? Double question for you there.
Thank you very much, James, for this crucial question. As far as I understand, and I'm sure President Tsereteli, if he will have the floor, also could say what his intention was. But for me, it was clear that I was appointed as rapporteur to invent what kind of documentation is there around the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Why was he assassinated? What could be done to prevent that such things happened in the future? But also, where is the guilt? Who did it? There is a lot of speculations. There is a lot of rumors. But as was said earlier by Senator Wicker, there is no proof. Nobody knows exactly who did give the order for the assassination. And I think this is a crucial issue. I would also like to mention that OSCE, as I said in the beginning, works with the rule of law, with democracy. And it's obvious that there is also the perspective of the importance of both to be a politician in opposition and in majority, to be respected and not killed because of your thoughts and your activity. And as well, of course, for the voters to know that it's possible to vote for a person. It doesn't matter if it's majority or opposition, or to be a part of the political spectra without any risk. And that's why I see this is so important. And of course, rule of law, that's what's all about. And it's not enough to have a constitution that looks good on paper. There need to be a practice. It need to be implemented as well. And I think this is crucial. And OSCE is a consensus organization, and we have not in the Parliamentary Assembly, not in the OSCE from the governmental side as well, a possibility to push forward and demand another member country to act in a certain way. But there is always the possibility to meet, possibility to discuss, possibility to raise an issue that some of us don't see as optimal, and of course for the others to replay and give their points of view. And I see this as a very important way to act, because, and that's also why I think it's important that Russia are a part of the organization. If they aren't, where should we meet? What other kind of possibilities are there to meet between countries? And I see it as a strength in our CEPA that we are parliamentarians from 57 member countries that meet on a regular basis. And we work also with quite a lot of different issues. And hopefully it brings something back also to countries who are not that democratic, but the process, I see it as very important. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Margareta. And you end on a very interesting and controversial point, which I've often had in discussion with OSCE representatives, which is, you know, it's a strength that Russia is a part of the organization, because I must confess it's the one area where I perhaps disagree with you, if I may, where I've often regarded it as a dilution and a weakening of the organization myself because of its need for consensus. Perhaps at this point, since you did mention it yourself, Margareta, Mr. Tsereteli, the president of the OSCE, would you wish to add to anything to Margareta's comments, her initial comments, or possibly my own slightly muted criticism there, which was not in any way meant to be offensive, but we didn't speak about this beforehand. You're certainly at liberty to refuse, but if you have anything to add, you're certainly welcome to do so.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very much pleased to participate in this discussion. Chatham House, it was a long time ago when I've been there. It was an on-site conference and I know rules, and thank you very much, James. And I know that Anna Morgan also was in charge of this organization. I'd like to greet all the members of this discussion, of the prominent, let's say, people on the screen. I'm particularly pleased to see my good friend Vladimir Karamurza. And I'd like to say to thank Vladimir, because he was one of main inspirators of the activities that we carried out in our parliamentary assembly, with the family, with lawyers of Boris Nemtsov. And personally, just to tell you, it's also to me it's quite a personal issue, because I knew him, I knew Boris very well, and every time when I'm touching this issue, I'm thinking of him. I'm remembering all our discussions or our meetings in different capitals. It was in Washington or Lithuania or in Georgia, in Tbilisi, when he visited us after Rose Revolution, and talking about developments of democracy all over the world, and of course, especially in Russia. And as you know, Margareta, she just provided her report. I would say that it was quite a courageous step from Margareta. Not maybe everybody was, let's say, very keen to carry out that, but when we spoke with Vladimir, with others, and it was a decision of the president to appoint special representative, and I chose Margareta because she's a very straightforward politician, and she's a politician of principles, and I guess she did a very important job. Of course, our American friends supported us very much. All Helsinki Commission members, and especially Senator Wicker and Senator Cardin and Chris Smith and others. I mean, this issue, I would say it united all of us, because we know what it's about. It's about, it's not about only one man, which is and one politician, but it's about the values, and it's about the, I think, a main principle of political activity, that everybody should have right to say and to work and to act as a politician. And unfortunately, what we're observing in Russia in the last decade and even before, so many victims of this modus operandi of the Kremlin and the people who I'm sure ordered this assassination or others. We know prominent journalists and some other politicians, and there's our attempt somehow to stop this process, and to, of course, the main idea to bring perpetrators to justice. Just for your information, we had also quite a, I think, important experience when we worked in the Parliamentary Assembly with the Senator Cardin and others, other members of Helsinki Commission on Magnitsky case, on Magnitsky's list. And and it was a really very effective effort. The sanctioning people who are taking part in those crimes. And you know that impunity is a main enemy for everything. And people, they feel that they can do everything that will continue that. In this case, especially when it comes to OSCE and the Parliamentary Assembly, you are right. We are not all the time practicing such activities. But I think as it was really quite a unique case, and it was also desire of many members of the Parliamentary Assembly, and I already mentioned the group of Russian activists and politicians and the family, so we started this. And I guess, although it's not, it was result oriented, but we knew what could be impediments and the barriers on our way. Of course, it was just one important, I would say, attempt to attract attention of the world, to attract attention of politicians, of the society, especially in Russia, especially also in the United States or whatever, in every country which matters for us, and which in the society of those countries, they are fighting for freedom and democracy. And OSCE is based on these principles. OSCE should be a watchdog for democratic development and rule of law. Sometimes our only instrument is to name and shame. And I think that for some countries or for some leaders, it's quite painful. And we're trying to do that. And I'm very much thankful to all our friends and our colleagues. And I'd like to mention that also United States Congress, they I guess adopted 2 resolutions supporting work of the Commission, all the work of Parliamentary Assembly, and all the team which worked on this, I would say, very emotional and quite painful issue.
Thank you very much indeed, President Tsereteli. I'm very grateful for those remarks, and perhaps that is a longer discussion about the OSCE you and I can have in this sort of semi-public format another time. You sort of briefly introduced, as I was about to, Vladimir Kara-Murza, known to many of you as a significant figure in the Russian opposition. We're going to unmute Vladimir right now. Vladimir, can I just ask you to say a couple of brief remarks, but just as an extra challenge, perhaps you could, as a way into segueing back into the conversation, end it with a question to either Professor Bowring or to Margareta to sort of suffix your initial remarks. Thank you.
James, I just wanted to thank you and Chatham House, first of all, for hosting this discussion today on a subject that is very important, not only to me, but to so many of our friends and colleagues in Russia. I've had the honor, it was the honor of my life to have worked with Boris Nemtsov for more than 15 years, and I now chair the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, which, among other things, as part of its mission, is doing everything it can to try to bring some sort of international accountability for what happened on that bridge 5 years ago, where accountability for the reasons we all understand is now not possible at home. Margareta Cederfelt mentioned the memory march that takes place in Moscow every year. Just a few months ago, at the end of February, just before all this quarantine set in, my friend and colleague Vadim Prokhorov, who was a longtime colleague of Boris Nemtsov, and I flew back from Vienna to Moscow, returned from the presentation of her report, to take part in that demonstration. It was, again, just as was every year, a sea of faces, a sea of people on the Boulevard Ring, of people who are not forgetting, despite all the efforts of the Kremlin. I want to take this opportunity to express my most profound gratitude to President George Tsereteli, who took the courageous decision and took on the responsibility for appointing the rapporteur and for paving the way for this comprehensive report. I want to thank Senator Roger Wicker, who was with us a few minutes ago, who was head of the US delegation, now as vice chair of the US delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, helped in a very significant way to make this report possible. And of course, above all, I want to thank Vice President Margareta Cederfelt for her commitment and dedication and for her hard work over these past several months in producing this report, which as of today, as of July the 28th, 2020, is the most detailed and comprehensive international legal document relating to the Nemtsov case. I think one of the most brazen things about this investigation for the past 5 years has been the obviousness of what was happening. As Margareta mentioned, and as is detailed in her report, from the very beginning, the Russian authorities tried to pretend that the murder of the political opposition leader had nothing to do with politics. They deliberately chose the wrong article of the criminal code. Instead of an assassination of a public statesman, for which there's a separate article in the Russian criminal code, and which Boris Nemtsov obviously was, they deliberately chose an article on common domestic murders to kind of take out any political considerations from it. They refused to hand out the video recordings from cameras on Bolshoi Moskovetsky Bridge because, as the Federal Protective Service explained publicly, the bridge in front of the Kremlin is not a protected object. I think anyone who has been to Moscow even once in their lives can judge for themselves the veracity of this claim. One of the key figures, one of the key persons of interest in the investigation, Major Ruslan Geremeyev, whom Senator Wicker has referred to, who was sanctioned last year by the US government under the Magnitsky Act for his role in organizing the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who is one of the closest confidants of Ramzan Kadyrov. This man, Ruslan Geremeyev, was not questioned by the Russian investigators because, as they state in the official report, when investigators turned up to his house and knocked on the door, nobody opened. Again, I think anybody who observes what is happening in Russia today, when, for example, a couple of years ago, Kirill Serebrennikov, a Moscow theater director, who was tried in another politically motivated show trial, when they were arresting him, he was escorted, I believe it was by 5 machine gun armed bodyguards from his apartment, a theater director who was accused, I think, of something to do with an economic crimes. Here is a man who is a key person of interest in a murder investigation, and he didn't open the door when they knocked, so they went away. And this list can go on for a long time, but the basic point is that there is such brazen impunity that has surrounded everything to do with the Russian national domestic investigation of this assassination. And I think it's been very clear to many of us for a long time, but now it is very important that this has become an official conclusion of the OSCE report, of Margareta Cederfelt's report, which you can find on page 43, the last page, and it states, and I want to quote here, the main issue for addressing impunity is not the capabilities of Russian law enforcement, but political will. End of quote. And so for the past several years, for the past 5.5 years now, the friends and colleagues of Boris Nemtsov, including myself, have been trying to do everything we can to try to bring some sort of international accountability. And, nothing can replace a genuine national investigation. And Magnitsky sanctions are not a replacement for actual criminal responsibility. If you murder someone, your punishment shouldn't be a visa ban or an asset freeze. And a parliamentary assembly report cannot replace a court conviction. But given the total and again very brazen unwillingness of the current Russian authorities to pursue a meaningful investigation into the organizers and masterminds of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, it has been very important that international organizations, and above all the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly under Margareta's leadership, have stepped in to provide this accountability. And another very important thing I should mention is that on pages 18 and 19 of Margareta Cederfelt's report, there is a detailed account of sworn testimony by Ahmed Zakiev, former Deputy Prime Minister of Chechnya, who provided evidence that in the winter of 2011-2012, during those protests that Margareta mentioned, Vladimir Putin and General Viktor Zolotov, his head of personal security, went to Chechnya and met with Ramzan Kadyrov. And that is when, according to Ahmed Zakiev's sworn testimony, a direct order was given for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Of course, needless to say, the Russian authorities did nothing to even pretend to pursue that line of inquiry. So we're profoundly grateful to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Margareta Cederfelt, for stepping in to provide that accountability that is lacking at home. We're grateful to the US Congress for passing those resolutions that were referred to the Council of Europe for its oversight. We'll look forward to the next real-life annual session of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, at which, as far as I understand, Margareta Cederfelt plans to transform her report into a supplementary item, a resolution that will be considered and hopefully adopted by the full OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And we are just so deeply grateful to everyone who is helping us bring one step closer to that day, which I know will come, when all of those, not only the immediate perpetrators who are in prison, but also the organizers and the masterminds of the most high-profile political assassination in modern Russia, are identified and brought to justice.
Thank you, Vladimir. yes, we can all agree, and we all have agreed on the importance and the thanks that are due to the OSCE and to Margareta in particular for this report, as well as the American involvement too. Right, it's bad chairing, of course, because we only have 25 minutes left for, I wasn't intending 5 speakers, I suppose, I was intending 3, or even 1 originally, Margareta. But we will move on, and Anna Davidson at the University of Oxford has a question that's very relevant, actually, to your very final remarks there, Vladimir. Anna, can we unmute you, please, and ask your question, which was excellent.
Thank you, James. So you can hopefully hear me now. Yeah, it's extremely pertinent to what Vladimir was just saying. I'm wondering, why is it so obvious that this was a political assassination? I mean, I'm looking at the Salisbury case as well. It seems quite similar. The sloppiness, the apparent sloppiness by the government in Chechen or Central Russian government in doing this, whereas everything else that I've seen in the character of the Russian government, the character of Vladimir Putin is very strategic, very operational, and very delicate. And this seems like the complete opposite. And it makes me think either one, that it wasn't the Russian government and it's someone else making it look like the Russian government, or it was the Russian government and they don't care if everyone else knows. So I'm wondering what thoughts you might have on that.
Yeah, I think we've been asking ourselves this for a long time. It's a very valid question, Anna. A slightly controversial one at that. Let me go to Margareta first, perhaps, with this question, is the evidence for government involvement, please. Over to you, Margareta.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for the question. I think this is the key issue. Who did actually order the assassination, the murder of Boris Nemtsov? Nobody knows. There are different indications, and you could either say that this is an unprofessional, arranged murder. That's one perspective, because there are 5 persons who are in jail. It looks like a murder outside of Kremlin. It can't be a well-planned attack. On the other hand, you can as well say the opposite. Outside of Kremlin, on the bridge that's the most, the place in Moscow with most high, I can't find the English word, but
visibility, yes. I understand. Yeah.
Yes, where a lot of it's really observed. And there were no cameras who could really target the murder. There was a car passing through. There's a lot of details that it could give explanation to why could this accident or this murder happen. Then all the way that the legal process was performed, it's different steps there that's not according to the rule of law. Then we have also the Russian system that nobody can do such a thing like the murder of Boris Nemtsov without permission from the top, because that's well known that in Russia is the top is President Putin, and things like a murder of the most famous opposition politician, former prime minister, it's not done without acceptance or even an order from the president. And that's the other side. It could be both against and it could be for. And for me, I must say, when I have read this, it's very strange that Boris Nemtsov was murdered. And I could say that President Putin stated that the murder was a provocation aiming to harm Russia's reputation. That was what President Putin said. But then there was also the investigative committee's spokesperson, Mr. Vladimir Markin, who said that the murder was a provocation aimed to destabilizing Russia. And he explained different reasons for the murder, like Boris Nemtsov's opinion on the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, the war in Ukraine, Mr. Nemtsov's own business activities, or his personal life. But the day before Boris Nemtsov was killed, he did express by himself that he frightened for his life. And why did he do so? He was going to present the report on the war in Ukraine, where there were Russian soldiers who have been promised that their family should get financial support if they were killed. This didn't happen. That was what Boris Nemtsov should present. Boris Nemtsov have also made research on corruption. Corruption in and around the political leadership up to the level of Putin. And he was a very straightforward person, talking about democracy, talking about the rule of law. And there are more issues where he was doing, and he was doing quite a lot of research and making different, publishing articles on rule of law and democracy. So there were several reasons for the political leadership in Russia to murder him. And I would also underline that when Boris Nemtsov was deputy prime minister, it was under Boris Yeltsin. And that was also when he was really, in a lot of people looked up on as the next president. This didn't happen. Putin stepped in on the arena. And this is also a part of the picture, but I think there should be an investigation. And this is really crucial for a state like Russia, for the political life, for the rule of law. There need to be a new investigation, and the Russia system need to open up and invite for scrutinization of the system and what have been said here. And I would also just like to say that I am very grateful for the cooperation with Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, because he have opened up his network for me, and it have been fantastic when I worked with this report, because I have done reports before, but I have never met so many people who wants to share their opinions, either to say that very clear that Boris Nemtsov was assassinated by the leadership, but there have also been those who have come and contact me on the totally opposite side and with different opinions, and the very, very large quietness from the judicial system and from the political leadership in Russia. They haven't responded at all. I'm sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you, Margareta. Bill, can I turn this over to you? And I'm going to play devil's advocate still with Anna's question here, in a way, literally, I suppose, because I don't disagree with anything Margareta said. But is it fair, as a barrister yourself, Bill, would a defense lawyer, if the Russian government was up in court over this, would it have a chance? Is the evidence circumstantial? Clearly, the Russian government is responsible for the environment in which it has happened. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of direct responsibility, what's your take on that?
So, thanks very much to Vladimir Kara-Murza for reminding us about Ahmed Zakiev's evidence. And that's just one of a whole series of lines which any competent investigative authority would have been following up. And I think there's a position which the Council of Europe has already taken, which is that the people who need sanctioning are the people responsible for the failure to take the necessary investigative measures required to identify the instigators and organizers. So I think that is a live issue which really needs hammering. I take issue slightly with something Anna said in the written version of her question, and again, orally just now, when she referred to the typically delicate operational behavior of the Russian government. And since Mr. Putin's re-election, I mean, there were some limited reforms during Medvedev's time, in particular legal reforms, and he was very open about legal nihilism and the need for reform. That has gone into sharp reverse since Putin came back. And I think when one looks at the illegal events since 2014, So the illegal annexation of Crimea, absolutely shameless. And I've written something on the legal justifications put forward by the tame academics for the Kremlin, and it's absolutely ludicrous. Donbass, MH17, which is winding its way through the courts at the present moment. Skripal, where Putin said publicly, we didn't do it, but Skripal was a scumbag. And it's even worse in Russian, by the way. And I'm representing still Litvinenko's widow, Marina, at the European Court of Human Rights. It's taking its time because of the inquiry in England. But what is quite clear there is that Alexander Litvinenko was murdered with radioactive poison. And we know that 2 Russians did it. And it's quite clear that that quantity of polonium comes from one state-owned factory in Russia. And therefore, the murder could not have been carried out without a green light from the Kremlin. So it's rare that you have a smoking gun, but what you do have is a big wink, in particular from Mr. Putin, when these kind of things are denied. So I think what one sees since 2014 in particular is a regime which is actually perfectly happy to present itself in a very bad light. The message being, don't mess with us. And I fear at the moment, I mean, this is not today's topic, for the future of Belarus, as a matter of fact. So I think the regime is looking for another Crimea, if it possibly can, particularly given that Putin's popularity is somewhat plummeting at the moment, and the regime is having difficulty holding things together. So that's my only disagreement with Anna.
No, it's a fair point of contention, and I appreciate what you're saying about a smoking gun, or I say, well, not so much a smoking gun as a big wink. And it reminds me of Vladimir Putin saying something similar about hackers. He didn't order the various cyber attacks, but it might be some patriotic Russian hackers. So again, a big wink. There is probably room for a couple more questions if people wish to raise their electronic hands, but I'm going to ask Richard Wright's question. He's been very patient for him. It's addressed to you, Margareta. It says, there are many opposition figures in Russia, but Mr. Nemtsov was singled out to be murdered. I mean, we might take contention with that, because of course, Bill made a very good point, a correct point, that in fact, there have been many murders. In fact, Nemtsov was simply the most high profile. But why do you think that it was he who was assassinated, Margareta? Again, Bill has answered this to an extent. And why, specifically, the most important part of his question is, why was he seen as such a threat to the state?
Thank you, James. I think I responded to this question a bit in my reply last, but Mr. Nemtsov, he has been a strong character and been dedicated to promoting democracy, and he worked tirelessly and fearlessly to expose and fight corruption, and produced several investigative reports under this subject. And at the time of his the murder, he was working on an investigative report on the Russian military involvement in Ukraine, as I mentioned. And in the report, which he was working on, he presented proof that Russian soldiers, contrary to claims from the Kremlin, were in fact participating and dying in the war in eastern Ukraine, and that the Russian authorities had sent them there. Mr. Nemtsov was also supposed to participate in a protest march, of which he was one of the organizers, on the 1st of March 2015. He was murdered on the 27th February 2015. The demonstration 2 days after assassination, it was supposed to be cancelled, but that this didn't happen. It was more of a morning march where more than 50,000 people took part in the march. This is a fantastic number, but I think he was assassinated and murdered because of his oppositional thoughts, and he was working very systematic and didn't take a step off from the road on his beliefs. I think that's the reason. But there need to be an investigation, and that's what I'm saying in the report. There is a lot of speculations there are in this year, but we need to know what happened. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. In the absence of any other questions, I'm going to have to ask enough of myself. I'm very sorry for boring you with my voice. And we're coming up to the half hour, or the full 90 minutes, in fact, so it's possibly a last one, but let's see how it goes. And I might ask Vladimir as well. But initially to you, Margareta, you've talked a lot about the Russian interference to your investigation, or the stonewalling obstructions. So it's a slightly speculative question, but I suppose I'm asking this. Do you see any prospects for, I mean, we shouldn't be too fatalistic about this for Russia's long term, but do you see any prospects for any improvement as far as the rule of law is concerned under this regime? Senator Wicker said there's a possible another 12 years of Putin now. That's true. But so is this regime beyond redemption, beyond hope? Or is it a question of some, I don't like the word, but strategic patience, and we have to work hard at the next incumbent in the Kremlin? Do you see any hope with Russia under Vladimir Putin? Margareta.
Thank you, James. I do always look for hope, even when it seems difficult. And what I see here as maybe a key forward is if there will be a lot of protest, very active protest against Putin. A dictator, I'm not saying Putin is a dictator, but the person who is a dictator need to have the people's will. Otherwise, it's impossible. And this is just the same for Putin. He needs to have the support from the Russian people. And if he gets in his fingertip that the only way for him to continue to rule as a president, it's not to go on with Ukraine, it's not to take Belarus, it's actually to open up. I am sure he would do so if there will be a strong pressure on him, not from other countries abroad, but inside Russia. Then I think he would change his mind. But then, the other hand, always look forward. Who is the next king, queen? I mean, who will succeed Putin? And I think there it's important not only to think about one person, but to think about the system, to think about who and what kind of ideas could be implemented for the future. And this is important. And try to change, trying to support more people to dare to be active, to oppose the majority. But this needs to be done. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'm going to go finally to sorry, I'm first going to go to Vladimir and then finally to Bill. Vladimir, can I ask you, do you mind me, I know you're not an official panelist here, do you mind me asking you the same question as to whether there's any hope under Mr. Putin? And also, I've noticed that Pete Duncan, my colleague at UCL London, has just said surely Nemtsov was murdered because he was the only person who could unite the opposition. So there's a sort of an extra little bit there. And then finally, I'll come to you with the same question, Bill. Vladimir, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And if I could very briefly just address Pete Duncan's comment, actually, he's saying there, as you just got it, surely Nemtsov was murdered because he was the only person who could unite the opposition. That was certainly one reason. The other reason, the most important reason in my view, is that, to put it plainly, Boris Nemtsov was the most effective and the most powerful voice in the Russian opposition to Vladimir Putin. He was the person who could do many things at the same time. He could unite the opposition, as Pete's saying there. He was also instrumental, for example, in getting the Magnitsky Act passed in the United States, something the Kremlin hates and fears most of all, those targeted sanctions against Kremlin cronies. And Senator John McCain's on the record publicly saying we would not have had a Magnitsky Act in the US without Boris Nemtsov. That is his quote. Boris could, get out tens of thousands of people on the streets of Russia to protest against the Putin regime, as he has done many, many times, as he continues to do now in the marches of memory. He also won an election, as Margareta mentioned. He was a member of the regional parliament at the time of his murder, something that genuine opposition should not be able to do under Putin's regime. He was able to do all that, and that is the reason he was the most dangerous opposition leader for the Kremlin. To your question, James, no, of course there is no hope whatsoever under the Putin regime, which, I think after 20 years it's pretty safe to make that assumption. The hope is with the young people of Russia. The hope is with the generation that we've seen increasingly on the streets all over our country in these past few years. Most dramatically last summer in Moscow, with disqualification of opposition candidates from the city elections, and of course in the last 2 weeks in Khabarovsk. If you will look at those protests, you will see that the vast majority of protesters, and the same goes for the wave of anti-corruption protests in 2017-18, the vast majority of those protesters represent the young generation, the people who are 18, 20, 22 years old. Mr. Putin turns 70 in a couple of years. That's not a good calculus to be. And I'm very hopeful. I do, as part of my work in the opposition, I travel all over Russia, and, we hold public events. And we used to have the stereotype, right, that the only democracy-oriented people live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That is no longer true, if that ever was. And those young people, that young generation, they want Russia to be a normal, modern, democratic European country, in my view, is the best hope that one day we will become one.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. And your remarks and indeed the question is relevant to a colleague of mine, Nikolai Petrov, who I think is on this call somewhere, who has just written a short piece saying, just testing that a little bit, saying that what comes after, it's a myth, he says, that what comes after Vladimir Putin must be better than Putin. I just leave that hanging there, and I would like you to finish off, if you don't mind, Bill, please.
Yeah, Mr. Putin is only slightly younger than me, and he's looking increasingly old, tired, and bad-tempered, as a matter of fact. And many people in Russia think that this is, sorry, okay.
That's good.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, it's all good.
Sorry, just saying I agree with Vladimir very much. Mr. Putin is only slightly younger than me, and he's looking increasingly old, tired, and bad-tempered. And by the way, the constitutional vote, which was not a referendum, has turned into a real poison chalice for him, I would say, and particularly with young people, as Vladimir was saying, all over the country. Many people in Russia now say this is remarkably reminiscent of the later years of Brezhnev in terms of the regime, but not in terms of the fact that that was Zastoy and relatively peaceful. This is absolutely not. And on the question why Boris Nemtsov was murdered, I think it's worth remembering that starting in 2008, together with Vladimir Milov, who is known to Chatham House, published a whole series of white papers which were very hard-hitting on Putin results, Putin and Gazprom, Putin the crisis, Putin the thief, in 2011, which have huge circulation. I would say much more hard-hitting than anything that Mr. Navalny has done, as a matter of fact. This 2013 report that $30 billion had been stolen from the funds for the Sochi Olympics, cronyism, embezzlement, threat to Russian national security, and as we've been reminded, he was murdered immediately before the publication of his reports on the Russian presence in eastern Ukraine. So he was, of course, at the time people met him in his 30s. I think there are people coming up in the younger generation, as Vladimir says, who will do things which will really surprise us. I think we're going to see a different type of opposition in Russia. I think Khabarovsk is enormously exciting. It's impossible not to be moved by that deeply, and it's not been sufficiently covered in the West. And we will see this in Moscow, we'll see it in St. Petersburg, we'll see it in Kazan and Yekaterinburg, without doubt. So I remain an optimist. I'm very glad that Vladimir also is an optimist. And to quote Pushkin, What changes has got to be better?
Oh, really? What changes has got to be better? That's interesting. I might disagree with that last part, Bill, but I take your point and I admire the optimism. Ladies and gentlemen, I've gone slightly over, but I think it was well worth it. I obviously need to thank my original panelists, in absentia, Senator Wicker, but also Bill just now, and most of all, perhaps, Margareta Cederfelt for the tremendous amount of work she's put in, and the two additional panelists for bonuses, President Sadatelli and Vladimir Karamuzar. Thank you very much for filling in, as did I. With a slight absence of questions there. I will try to rearrange that. But we will get back to this subject and many others in the months to come. I would just say, as it's the end of July, that my team at Chatham House rather desperately need a break and a summer holiday. We won't do any events in August unless I don't know, unless Belarus is invaded. But for the most part, we probably won't. And we'll get back to you in September. But I really would like to thank all 5 of you for this, and I bid you goodbye and thank you very much. All the best.